Alright, 6 movies this weekend, as this whole month really is going to be packed with a lot of the big movies coming out. And yeah, so let's go ahead and start with Ford versus Ferrari. This is one of those projects that feels like it was like forever in the making, and we were never quite sure exactly what it was. For the longest time, I remember it being Michael Mann was going to make something called Ferrari that was going to star Christian Bale, and then Bale kept like backing in and out of it over and over and over again. Sort of like the whole Steve Jobs thing. And then ultimately, Michael Mann is still an executive producer on it, but now it is James Mangold, who obviously did Logan and Walk the Line and 310 to Yuma, and one of the most diverse filmographies I think ever. Copland, all that stuff, Girl Interrupted, Identity. He's touched just about everything, and you can add this sort of material to that as well. Where I'd stated before in some of our awards videos that I was getting a lot of Rush vibes from it, Ron Howard's movie from 2013. And you can see that also, but there's a lot of stuff going on in this one, all of which is pretty great. So, talking about Bale and Damon being at the center of it, and they're like you would think a movie so sort of seemingly focused on like the spectacle of the cars and the race scenes and all that. There's like so much character work in this, particularly from the two of them. That's really credible, particularly with Bale. It's easy to see how Bale's gotten a lot of like early notices and buzz because it's like he's doing that sort of, you could almost call it a typical Bale thing, but all his characters are so incredibly diverse, it still feels new, which is, he's able to do this sort of like, his character's like a live wire, like constantly, but at the same time, there's like, the character is so like grounded in humanity, and there's like so many different scenes where he gets to play this off, not necessarily even just the physicality that comes with like the racing scenes, but like there's like extensive scenes of him with his wife and his son, who are Katrina Balfe and Noah Jupe from A Quiet Place and Suburbicon and Honey Boy. And it's he's really carving out a nice filmography already. He's like what 10 or 12 or something. And yeah, on top of Bale, also we have Damon, who doesn't seem to have been getting like the buzz and attention that Bale's been getting, but he's still really damn good and really is kind of at like sort of the center of this. Like obviously they're both at the center of it, but particularly Damon's character is where it all kind of branches off from. And he immediately kind of sets up at the very beginning this character that's like not only knows all this stuff in and out, but we see how like deeply emotional of a thing that is when we see scenes where like we get a glimpse of his last race in the opening moments, but it's only a little bit later when he describes that race in detail to John Bernthal that it's like you really see the different facets of this character in kind of this one moment, to where it just kind of all makes sense for this character for the entire rest of the movie, and all his motivations are like in the light. So yeah, and there's a really great and recognizable cast throughout with like Bernthal and Josh Lucas and a number of people. Ray McKinnon has a really nice part. Tracy Letts also really stands out as Ford, where it's especially at the beginning he's like this really commanding force, where he comes out and he's kind of revving everybody up about where they stand right now and how like far behind Ferrari they are, and it's like, and he's big and yelling and all that, but it's like it really is. Tracy Letts is an actor like so experienced and so in tune with his characters that he can go beyond that. Where like even when he's like yelling and screaming, there's like something you can still see below that, and like sort of a desperation, or somebody that's kind of like on like the last thing where it's like this really is pretty much it. Like we're pretty much doomed, unless we can show up Ferrari more or less. And one thing this movie could have done that might have been a bit alienating, that some people may be expecting, is the fact that the plot is that they have to build a car from like the ground up that will can somehow beat Ferrari in this 24-hour race. So it's the kind of movie that probably easily could have been like bogged down in like the mechanics of it. But it's that stuff is in there, but I don't think in any particular way that somebody would get like behind. Um, so I think that's a really strong way to take that. And then it's also that in talking about the racings themselves, where one thing they did that I really loved about how they handled the racing is how it feels like a lot of it's there. Like even if we only get like two really big race scenes, the Daytona scene and then the final one. But you still kind of constantly get them. Like there's constantly them like Bale doing all the test runs and all that. And it does feel like it's constant without being too overbearing, without getting too tedious about it. Because the brilliant thing they do with the final race is it's built up throughout the movie that it's a 24-hour race. And the thing about that is, if you're like me, you probably went in thinking, well, that's probably a large portion of the movie. Like it's basically like a climax that's the entire second half of the movie, basically. It would have to be. But no, they managed to condense that down into it strictly being a climax. It's maybe the last 20 to 25 minutes or so out of a 2.5 hour movie. Which it might sound like it's cutting it a bit short, but it actually works really well, especially with the Daytona scene not being that far behind it. And the thing about that is that the racing scenes are never not gripping. There's always a moment where you're afraid Bale's going to crash at some point, or somebody's going to crash around him, or something is going to happen. And the way they're shot, and the sound in particular, is incredible. Even like I saw The Good Liar before this, and when I was in the other movie, you can hear Ford versus Ferrari like throughout the theater, and it's amazing. But there's also, even when it's not the racing scenes, there's a particular moment when Damon flies a plane and it flies over, and the sound like shakes the theater, and it's really that's that in another movie where the sound wasn't as like meticulously done, that might seem obnoxious, but it's one of those it feels like you're there sort of things, which is really great. So especially for a movie like this. But yeah, even despite the fact that the racings feel like that, I do think that if the final race was like the entire second half of the movie, at some point surely it would have maybe gotten a bit redundant or tedious, or maybe people would start tuning out or whatever. So I think it's actually a really great decision to kind of have the two races towards the end and the main one being like an actual legitimate climax rather than something so big, because I think that would have maybe done in the suspense of it a little bit. But the thing about that also is you would think the race scenes would be like the great thing about this movie, and the thing that really makes it stand out, and the thing you kind of wait for whenever they're not happening. But the brilliant thing about this movie is that apart from the fact that the race scenes are insane and amazing, even when it's just the characters, not even necessarily involving the race scenes, this movie is just like one really great individual scene after the other. Like with hardly any sort of, dry spot or filler in between. There's there's one particular moment that's kind of split up in two scenes where it's already a great moment when Ferrari gives the message to John Bernthal that's basically not even necessarily a challenge to Ford, but just basically telling Ford that he's worthless and his company's going to die, and on top of it, he's fat. And it's a really great moment where we see where kind of Ferrari stands in this, the way he just sort of tears him down, almost like completely inhumanly, to Bernthal's face. But then the fact that we can see this scene all over again when Bernthal relays the message word for word to him is in itself a great moment also, and maybe even better because we're getting the direct reaction. So it's like the way you can do two scenes back to back that are basically the same thing happening, and one is even more enticing than the last, is fantastic. And then you've got stuff like the scene where Damon convinces Ford to let Bale be the driver is in itself a really great scene. The dialogue in particular is like really really strong. Then there's another moment with Bale in the car with his wife when he's trying to decide, and she more or less tries to make the decision for him in this very drastic way. It's great, and it's not just is it a great scene, but the relationship between the two of them is really showing its strength there. In many scenes in particular, but this scene in particular really stands out. And the same with any scene he has with his son is also, it's not necessarily just, oh, these are the scenes with the wife character, oh, these are the scenes with the kid character. They're like all really, like, these really big moments for his character and really like establish the wife and son as like these really, really major components in his life. So all that works really well. And then there is another driving scene that's not necessarily a race scene when Damon takes Ford out. And not only is this kind of an exhilarating scene where we more or less see this from the perspective of Ford, but then it starts off as kind of funny and then actually kind of flows into like a really genuine, heartfelt, emotional reaction. And it's like scene after scene after scene of all this. And like that's the stuff that's not even the racing scenes. And it's like, this is a really fucking well done movie in so many different aspects, but it's like especially in character. So yeah, and there's like at first I was a little worried, like in the first 15 minutes or so, because it almost felt a bit maybe too light. Like in the first 15 minutes, it kind of feels like this is just the kind of movie that is made for awards, and that's it. But then as it went on and we got these really strong scenes one right after the other, then the strengths like really came through in this really, really big way. And I'll probably end up seeing this again, so I'm curious how the whole movie feels now that I know where everything sort of, all the directions it goes and how powerful the rest of the stuff is. Because there may have been stuff I wasn't giving a chance in that first 15 minutes that'll seem strong in the whole full picture of it. And even keeping in that light tone, there is still stuff that's like genuinely funny. Like there's a physical fight between Damon and Bale that is kind of hysterical, despite being this sort of peaking point between the two of the characters, and the two of them, and what's going on between them. And yeah, and then it goes into the final race itself is intense from the very start. And never really lets up in many ways. There's like so many different conflicts that come into play that you don't quite see come, I guess, unless you know the history. But if you don't know the history, it's just constant conflicts that keep finding their way into this. And just when you think something's going great, there's another thing that's standing in the way they have to go around. So it's like even on top of, once again, not even using the racing scenes as like a crutch in any sort of way, where it would be like, this is the most exciting aspect, here's what you came here for. But there's so much stuff that's like within that's just as gripping and enticing and all that. So it all just really comes together. I mean, it does reach those, some cliche moments, like, towards the climax of the final race, and we're watching, the family at home cheering him on and stuff like that. It seems like that are in like every damn movie ever. But yeah, and then it goes on a little further, and once again, it was something that I almost thought was a problem, but then the movie proved me wrong, which was, it's one of those movies that feels like at the start it might have maybe one too many endings. But when we do get to the ending that it is, like the actual last scene, it is like, it does bring like really earned closure. So yeah, like it's almost to the point now to where it's like, I'm trying to imagine why I would have wanted the movie to have ended without that scene, because it just kind of just settles just sort of one more thing and leaves one and gives one more piece of closure before it goes off, and it's yeah. So I figured that I would like it, especially since I love Rush so much, and that's what I kept comparing it to in my head. But I wasn't expecting, I don't think, something this good with so many great scenes in it. So yes, so that's fantastic. So let's go on to Charlie's Angels, the Elizabeth Banks directed, I guess you could say, reboot of Charlie's Angels. where I pretty much sought this out strictly for Kristen Stewart, who obviously I'm a huge fan of, and it's like, well, the more support shown to her movies like this, the more, interesting indie movies she gets to do. So, and yeah, she's immediately the first thing we see. Like, it's actually like a close-up of her face is the very first shot of the movie. And it's this really kind of cool scene where she's doing this sort of Mr. and Mrs. Smith style, like, half seduction, half we know this is a dude she's, like, spying on and getting information out of, and this is all some big setup. But there's, like, so, just the way the scene builds, and, like, she shows that her character has, like, this almost, what's interesting is this setup shows that her character has, like, this sort of sexy dominance to her. But then you realize just how much of a ruse that is when you realize the rest of the movie, her character is like anything but that. Like, this little facade she's putting on is so much smoother than she actually is. But it was kind of sticking out to me weirdly as you learn throughout the movie. The only thing that stuck out about this scene is that despite how deeply undercover she is, she's using her real name. Which happens throughout the movie, regardless of how undercover they are. So that's weird. But I don't think the movie's too concerned about stuff like that, I suppose. So yeah, so we have this really nice opening where they build up exactly what they do, and we see this nice little operation they've put on. It shows off the characters' personalities really well as they like unmask themselves, and it does go into this moment I'm still confused by. Even to this very moment. I saw the movie last night, and I'm still confused by this. It cuts to a montage of children before showing us the title. I think they're doing what the McGee movies did with Cameron Diaz and Drew Barrymore and Lucy Liu, where it shows them like as they were in their previous lives before they became, Charlie's Angels or whatever. But we never see these children again. I don't know if it's supposed to be the children versions of them, or what. But then the title just comes up and we never hear about that again, at least as far as I remember. So anyway, then it goes on, and then it's just, a generic plot for these characters to play with this stuff. But there are some different things that they're doing here in regards to, like, how the angels are set up. How previously, as far as we knew, there were 3 angels, and Charlie, and a Bosley, and that was it. But now it's like there are different, like, I guess, sectors of angels all over the place, and each have a different Bosley. Michael Strahan's there for some reason as one of them on a screen. But the main ones we see in the movie are Elizabeth Banks, Patrick Stewart, and Jaimin Anzu. And there's even this nice moment towards the beginning. I usually don't go too much into the meta thing, but I guess because it just caught me so by surprise. Where they're sending off Patrick Stewart because he's getting close to retirement, and so they're showing his life in the agency in pictures, and there's one of him photoshopped in with the angels from the TV show, and then him photoshopped on Bill Murray's body with Cameron Diaz, Drew Barrymore, and Lucy Liu around him. And it's like that was an interesting little meta joke that they threw in to assume that he's been the Bosley this whole time or whatever. But yeah, so you don't really go into movies like this for the plot, because it's just going to be some generic spy thing, and there'll be twists and turns, and people you think you can trust you actually can't. It's one of those cases where every time they think they're concealing something, they're making it even more blatant. It's like you can pinpoint it from a mile away. I swear, my hand to God, like a month ago, I read the cast list to my brother over the phone, and he predicted the direction this movie goes, I swear to God. So, based on that, though, yeah, the only thing that's going to give this movie a real strength is the characters and the actresses, particularly Kristen Stewart, Naomi Scott, and Ella Valencia, I think her name is. That's how it looks. I'm really not familiar with her at all. I'm not sure what she's done outside of this, but Naomi Scott, obviously, she was Jasmine in the Aladdin remake, so... I think she was in The Martian also at one point, and a few other things. But yeah, they're the real strength to this. Particularly, maybe this is just my being a Kristen Stewart fanboy, but I feel like she really got me through a lot of this movie, because it's like she has this way about her where like her character is kind of like, you can see a lot of her like real life persona coming through, where she's like kind of loose and cool about herself, but she's also something that I thought was a really interesting turn to take her in. Was a lot of these indie movies you see her in, she's like, you know, are particularly serious, and she's playing kind of a straight faced character. And of course, in the twilight phase of her life, she got this reputation for just having a blank personality, which is totally and entirely false. It's strictly those movies didn't know what to do with her. Um, but here she's tasked with playing the funny one, which I thought was really kind of inspired and something I think she does really well. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it feels like she's, I don't know if this was intentional, but it feels a lot like she's channeling Kate McKinnon. And however you feel about Kate McKinnon, I think will determine how you feel about her in this movie and this performance. But given that I absolutely love Kate McKinnon, and I love just about everything Stewart does, this was kind of working. Now, much like Kate McKinnon, though, kind of like we talked about in the new Ghostbusters, was most of the time it really works for me, and I'm like, you know, it's like usually it works, and you know, it can be really charming and really funny. It's not always going to. I mean, when you're trying to do this much with like this big of a personality, you're gonna fall flat every now and then. It's just gonna happen. They can't all be winners. But for the most part, I really liked what she was doing, and I thought it was a really nice sort of different direction than you would expect her to go in with a character. So that was really refreshing. Then you have Naomi Scott, who's kind of the like the naive rookie of the bunch. The third one doesn't really get a whole lot to do, unfortunately. But Naomi Scott gets, you know, she's basically kind of the one joke character where everything is like happening around her, and she's like, but she still has some of these like genuinely funny moments where like there's because she fucked up at one point. They're like, why don't you just stay on the side? Why don't you just stay right here and we'll do whatever. And then later on, she's like makes this big stand, and she's does the whole character bit that we expect. Like, you know, I can be useful. I can do this thing, and it's time for me to stand up and do this and be a part of this because I'm going to be one of you. And they're just like, well, yeah, that's why you're at this meeting. This is you doing this. Like, what do you even like? What are you even talking about? You're doing it now, and it's so that stuff like that actually does come through. And of course, you know, she's going to be inept with many of the gadgets and stuff like that. So yeah, it really just depends on, I think, how you feel about the characters, whether you're going to find this entertaining or unbearable, and I can see it going both directions. And I don't know, something about it was working for me, and I really think, I mean, I'm sure, you know, Kristen Stewart and the cast have a lot to do with it. Elizabeth Banks and Patrick Stewart, obviously. Jaime's not here as much as I would like him to be, but still his presence is always appreciated regardless. But really, movies like this, for me, are just kind of like, it's really just kind of a flip of a coin. Because I was very easily imagining this movie, like, being the exact same movie that it is, like, changing nothing and having, like, a different cast. I'd probably hate it. Like, it's same thing with, like, it was kind of reminded me of Hot Pursuit with Reese Witherspoon and Sofia Vergara, which is a movie I still defend. And it's like, if that movie were exactly the way it was with two different people, I would despise it. But that's how much, like, an appealing cast can take certain writing or whatever. Is like, there are moments where you can tell that it's not everything that it could be. Like, if you're like me and you know at least the first movie with Cameron Diaz, Drew Barrymore, and Lucy Liu very well, much more than I should. Like, I probably pretty much know that movie front to back, unfortunately. But the thing is when you look at like the way that those movies handle like the missions. There was definitely like a fun angle to them, and like the sort of creative things they did with that, even if they were like incredibly over the top. This movie doesn't really go that route. Like the mission aspect of it isn't like as fun as something like that, and not as creative. And you can kind of say that about the action also, where like it doesn't have the over the top action of those movies either, but it's like. Those movies were so incredibly over the top, but at the same time, those movies were like half playing it as is, half parody. And I think this one's more or less like there's meta stuff and there's self-aware stuff, but it's never like treading the line of full-on parody like the other movie was. The other movie was intentionally. So you kind of miss that factor of it. You kind of want it to go really over the top and goofy the way those other movies did, because that's kind of what made them what they were. More so the first one, Full Throttle, obviously is notoriously not that great. But that first one is just a guilty pleasure up and down for me, quite honestly. I mean, how can you fail with an over-the-top parody action movie with villains played by Tim Curry, Crispin Glover, and Sam Rockwell? There's yeah, and this movie doesn't necessarily have that level of just embrace all the shit that comes at you. I kind of picked and chose what was like, okay, I'll let that slide, and oh, this is just, they could have done better. So yeah, and some of the dialogue is a bit like, I just talked about this a couple weeks ago with Terminator. Dark Fate, when I talked about, and there is no movie in existence where somebody says EMP without having to say what it stands for. 2 weeks later, here we are again. Electromagnetic Pulse comes back. And like I said, it was really weird to try to get past the whole, they're using their real names in these missions. I don't know what that's about. But yeah, so as far as the action goes, when it's not basically the characters that are keeping it alive, it's not, the action isn't boring, and I know that sounds like really faint praise, but that's kind of like that's the most typical thing of like bad action, is it just becomes very boring, and it's like really shoddily put together. And this doesn't really falter from any of that kind of thing. It's just kind of there, and it keeps the scenes moving, and it's fine. It is bad that we are to a point now to where, as long as action is done relatively competently, it's passable. Because there's just that many shitty action movies. But yeah, like I said, we're not here for the plot, and it's not a particularly great one, and you can see all of its secrets coming from a mile away. So yeah, so honestly, it was fine. The characters mainly keep it alive, and especially Stewart. You'll either be completely and totally annoyed by her or fall in love with her, one or the other. And that's basically what the movie hinges on. There's also stuff going on during the end credits with a bunch of random-ass cameos. Some of them make sense, obviously. Some of them are totally and completely random and make no sense whatsoever. I'm not really sure what that was about, but that's what the end credit sequence is, so there it is. Apparently Drew Barrymore is a producer on this also, because that kind of connects it to the other movies also, which I didn't know going in, so yeah. So if like it was kind of more in the vein of those, even though it's trying to do the whole reboot thing, it probably would have been better off to just go the whole completely over-the-top route, but it doesn't, so yeah, so then let's go into The Good Liar. The first on-screen pairing of Helen Mirren and Ian McKellen, I believe, though I think they've done a lot of stage work together. But they seem to, like, it seems like a pairing that should have happened a long time ago on screen, anyway. Where we kind of get this sort of Hitchcock-like thriller. Actually, it's very, very Hitchcock, or at least trying to be. Where Ian McKellen is this con artist that goes around, basically, I guess, wooing women and then ultimately weaseling their riches out of them while going about his merry way. And he may not also have much, much darker things in his past. And his next target is Helen Mirren. And that's the setup. And it's one of those movies where you can pretty much... It's got a lot of secrets it's hiding, but you kind of get the sort of broad idea pretty early. And it's just a matter of watching, like, there's, like, where it really lacks when it's trying to do the whole Hitchcock thing is sometimes you can feel like it's kind of a nice slow build and you're kind of see things unraveling ever so slowly. But there's also some cases, particularly in, like, its tone in general, where it's in kind of a hurry. But if you're not taking it that approach, I think you can actually grow to like the way it sort of shows its hand a little bit every now and then, even if it's not showing you everything. Like this contrast from the very start, where we see there's a whole opening credit sequence where they're messaging back and forth on their laptops, and then we get this moment where they meet and have dinner, and they're two older people, and they're saying like, "Oh, I told this big, humongous lie. I used another name on the internet. Oh God!" And it's like, "Please, still trust me." And it's like that's the biggest thing. And so it's like they're just two older people appreciating each other's company, and they've had, not they don't neither one has much family left, so they have this connection, and it's nice. And then we immediately he goes from that dinner to a strip club where he meets up with Jim Carter, who is like his partner in this. Jim Carter, who you will know as Carson on Downton Abbey, is his whole kind of partner in crime with this thing. And you immediately see that contrast, and it's like that alone, that change in location basically spells out the two different sides of his character right there in front of you at the very start. So that stuff like that is interesting. But like I said, when you look at the picture as a whole, it's maybe it shouldn't have played its cards so quickly. Like they could have built up a lot more that he's like just a totally innocent old dude. I mean, obviously we kind of know the plot going in because of like advertising or if you watch trailers or whatever. But I still feel like they could have played with that just a little more before we started kind of revealing exactly the kind of person he is as quickly as they do. So yeah, and then there is the moments that do work. Where it's just the two of them like on their little dates. Like there's a moment when they go. The movie's set in 2009, so there is a moment where they go to the theater for like a little date night, and they see Inglourious Basterds, and they come out debating whether the historical inaccuracies are gonna be a problem for the youth when when the youth comes out of a movie like Bastards and thinks that's what really happened. And stuff like that really works. Like that's another scene they could have had before. Really showing their hand in regards to the sort of sinister nature. And it's the way we see, like, that swing in his location being, like, not just in his background, but in his personality also. So, yeah, they could have, I think, and it could have given McKellen, I think, a lot more sort of stuff to play with, and, like, really kind of played with the whole, this is a guy that's clearly under, like, some sort of facade, and sort of had more time to do that. Obviously, he gets to do that throughout the movie, with the Mirren scenes alone, but having the scene where he goes to the strip club like right after that first dinner, when the opening credits have barely ended, I do think is maybe just a tad too early, and they could have played that up a little more. That Hitchcock build up, just a little bit longer. But yeah, but something that you could maybe defend that choice with is what is so good about McKellen's performance is that even us knowing, at least having an idea of the kind of person he is and what exactly his plans are with Mirren, is that he's so incredibly charming when he's under the facade that even though we know the type of person he is, he can still charm even us. And it's almost like we get pulled back into who he was in the first scene, even though the movie's already kind of shown its hand a little bit. And I think that's where kind of the genius of his performance comes from throughout the movie. Especially as more is unraveled and the more sort of that facade drops more and more, and we kind of see a bit more of a vicious side that he has to him. Because it is consistently surprising throughout the movie, like, what he's capable of. Because he always ends up falling back on the whole, he has the regular old guy facade going on. But, I do think there is an issue, though, with the tone, where it's like, even though it is genuinely surprising, some of the places that it's like, oh, we never even realized just how far he would go to do this particular thing. When that thing happens, once we get over the initial, like, oh, shit moment, we realize the tone's all over the place. And it's like, oh, it's... Because once it gets into, like, that darker territory... it feels like such a far cry from where we were in the moment. And it's like, it's another one of those cases where maybe if it was later, maybe we had more build-up, then there would be something, and we gradually got to that point. But no, these turns just kind of happen suddenly. And like I said, while that's good for a surprise factor eventually wears off. So that's kind of where the movie starts to run into problems. And then eventually, it's going to get to... where a whole bunch of stuff is revealed. But the thing is there's one in particular that, once again, kind of comes a little earlier than we're expecting, which in another movie might be genuinely shocking. But we also know, like, you get a sense of a movie structure, especially if you've seen enough of them, to where something, like a huge bombshell is dropped of information, but it's like, we can sense that it's early enough in the movie that, like, this isn't the bombshell. And you can just kind of get a sense of the structure, and it kind of lays out a blueprint for where the surprises will be coming once, they lay down maybe one thing too many too early. And some stuff like that, it's going to make a movie like this completely and totally fold up, because this is what movies like this are, like, hinged on, is that whole sort of unraveling thing. And it's like, surprises where they come from, and it's like, if you drop one big surprise on us a little early, we know you're not done with us, and we're just waiting for it. You're not gonna. There's a very rare chance you're gonna catch us off guard now after this has happened, and there's still like half an hour of the movie left. And there's also, in this particular moment I'm talking about, they use a flashback, which kind of totally. It doesn't necessarily halt the momentum like it probably would in another movie, but it redirects the momentum in a way that's not really as strong as where we had the way we were building up to it. And then once all of its cards are laid out, it's like there's, as it goes on, there's more and more gravity to it, but for the most part it feels like a pretty weak conclusion, especially when they tack on a couple of endings. And it's just like, well, this moment would have been a good ending, and it's like the opposite of Ford versus Ferrari. It's like we didn't need any other payoffs. You could have stopped it at that one point. These are just driving home the points we know. So it's like they kind of ran out of steam pretty quickly there, especially in that last half hour. So that's kind of a bummer, but there's still quite a bit to like about them, particularly the two of them. Because when it does work, it does really work. And there still is, a certain effectiveness to those surprise factors that are in there, but yeah, overall, though, it does some harm to the overall effect of the movie, so that's pretty much what that is. Let's move on to Parasite, which is a really interesting case for many reasons, one of which being, oftentimes in America, you may notice that when you see the movies that are really hyped up and can be considered like one of the most hyped or talked about movies of the year, more often than not, foreign movies don't find their way on those lists. But this one seems to be right at the top of it for this year. And it's one of those cases also because it's so popular now, and there's so much hype behind it, is it's almost like getting to the point where it's got kind of a bit of a disadvantage for people who are just now going into it, because it's like, it's got a hype that almost seems like it would be impossible to live up to, but it just keeps continuing to meet those expectations, if not pass them, for most people. And yeah, it's really a case we really don't see very often at all. And because also of that popularity, I'm not really 100% sure. This is another one of those cases where I'm not sure when you would be saying too much or not about the movie itself. So if you're worried about that at all, and you haven't seen it, I would probably just get away from this, even though I'm not going to go much into like the second half, just for the sake of that. But yeah, because the entire first hour or so, while it could be its own movie by itself and would still be massively entertaining, is just the setup. So, so I'll leave that at that. But in the meantime, this is, of course, coming from Bong Joon-ho, who has quite an extensive filmography. Mainly, his most well-known stuff is probably like Memories of Murder and Mother and The Host, and Snowpiercer is I think where some American audiences started to really see him. Though there was a lot of horror fans that I know were very familiar with The Host when it came out also. And obviously he's an extremely unique filmmaker, and not only does this not continue that, but kind of takes it in a direction he hasn't yet, in many aspects. Some of it might seem familiar thematically, but as far as like from a storytelling perspective, This is definitely some new territory, but not just in his filmography, but just about anybody's. Where it becomes this sort of a whole almost masterclass in like misdirection, where it's one of those cases of even in like the first half when they're still doing the setup. If you're not too familiar with what it is, just sort of the way it gradually unfolds and things kind of fall into their individual places. It's a whole setup where it's like, I think one of the most fun things about it, you may be hearing how it's like, you know, a dark comedy more or less, even though it does go in some pretty shocking and disturbing directions. But there's also like this sort of fun aspect to it. A lot of people I don't think go in expecting, where it's, you could say the direction it eventually goes in the second half is really, really sick and twisted. But the first half also, even when they're doing all the setup, is sick and twisted in its own way also, but in a much more darkly funny way to fall into that. It's actually almost like the entire movie's foundation is funny. It's just a matter of what direction we're gonna jolt in after something is funny. We can like start off at funny and then go into something totally shocking, or we can start off with something funny and then kind of ease our way quickly into something really sad at the same time. So yeah, and that's something that he's kind of really mastered over his career, but I think probably most notably, like he's kind of reached almost like a peak here in a way. And so yeah, the whole setup being that there's the family, the first family of four that lives in like this basement, and there's I think they alluded to the father had like some business ventures that fell through, so now they're pretty much living in poverty in this basement, where they have to fend off whatever. There's a dude that keeps pissing right outside their window, and they're just in this really bad place until they get this opportunity from a family friend to go, for one of them, the son, to go tutor the daughter of this really rich family in this giant mansion, and they basically find a way to one by one put themselves in the places of this family by eliminating some of the other people that are like a housekeeper or a chauffeur and take their places in very delightfully sick and twisted ways. And like I said, that by itself is the setup, and like the first almost hour of the movie, like the first 45 minutes or so, that could have been the whole movie and they would have had something. But then it's what it eventually has up its sleeve that has so many people talking. And while that is like a really interesting setup, and obviously the script is one of the strongest aspects of it, it's the way the movie's told visually, I think, that like really, really stands out. We're just completely right off, just the production design of this house, where the house is practically its own character. And that's something people say a lot about, you know, big inanimate objects. Like, you could, like, a lot of movies set in New York, they say, like, you know, New York's practically a character in the movie. No, this, except for, the only thing stopping this house from being a literal character in the movie is that it doesn't speak. But everything else about it pretty much makes it a character in the movie, which is amazing. And there's also just kind of the contrast itself, where we get kind of a half tour of the house, kind of, where the camera goes through at least a few of the rooms in one shot, and we really get a sense of that whole, like, it's an old, you know, visual trick to show the layout of your place, because that may be, you know, really important, exactly what is where, and that you know where you are in crucial moments later. Like I said, in this case, you feel they're really showing this off for a particular reason, apart from just saying, "Hey, here's the setting." And it's like just the contrast between the vastness of it and then the basement that they, you know, came from. And there's also talking about the visual way they can tell the story without practically any dialogue is the way the lighting itself. Not just the way, like, some scenes are lit, but I mean literally, whether the lights are on or off is saying something. As far as, like, there's symbolism all day, every day, throughout the entire movie. To go into it entirely, you would need like 6 videos, but just kind of on the surface front. There's so many things where you can tell. To my understanding, this is significantly more effective with multiple viewings, which I can totally understand. But even when it's like a first viewing, you can kind of get a sense of what seemingly mundane thing might ultimately be crucial in one way or another. So there's that. And kind of in general, it just sort of sets this mood that would be like that you could never really express on paper. Where it's like I'm all for praising the script as much as people want, but the real strength in the storytelling is definitely just the visual, and how a lot of the most powerful stuff that's told in the movie is not even through dialogue. There's, without saying too much necessarily, there is a particular moment with the father of the poor family towards the end. It on the surface might seem like it comes from out of nowhere, but there has been like so much build up to it throughout the entire movie, strictly visually, to where it makes perfect sense that it ends up at that point. And that obviously has a lot to do with the performance of Song Kang-ho, who has obviously been in many of Bong Joon-ho's movies, as well as he's a frequent collaborator of Chan-Wook Park. Also, he was in like Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and Lady Vengeance and Thirst. Thirst is a movie I talked about on this channel just a couple of years ago. Obviously there's a reason that this is sort of the two of them are kind of a bit of a dream team when they work together with all this. Once again, looking at the rest of the stuff they've done together, like, you know, the Memories of Murder and The Host and all that, and Snowpiercer even, this kind of just feels like the pinnacle of everything they've both been working towards, whether it be in direction and writing on Bong Joon-ho's part, or in Song Kang-ho's case, acting. So, yes, and then it obviously eventually gets to this moment in the middle, where we get a sense that this is the big turning point that we've been coming to. And it really just kind of is this whole... I feel like you could stop right at this moment, like right before it happens, and you could guess just about anything is going to happen. Like, it's one of those cases where you're starting to wonder if the genre is going to change. But not just in, like, sort of a slight way, but, like, in a really big... Like, it really, like, messes with your imagination, and your imagination just completely takes off in this moment. And what's great about that is that it gives you the room. Like, it doesn't go immediately into what it's going into. There's, like, kind of a stopping moment there where we have time as an audience to imagine where the hell this is going. And all the different places we could possibly think of. It's probably not the one that it goes in. So, and that might sound like it's not, like, you know, outlandish, which is, I think, definitely in the movie's favor. But still, it's not a place I don't imagine people can pinpoint, given the setup at the time. And yeah, because talking about it not going the outlandish route, I can see people thinking this is maybe a bit, like, there's a lot of suspension of disbelief regardless of how, in many ways, grounded the movie is, but I think there's a lot of cases where I can see people calling stuff out, where I can see it being totally intentional, like the fact, when they're setting up that whole ruse in the first half, there are some portions of their ruse that, like, kind of starts to take off by itself. Where it's like, they set up like one domino, and they just happen to knock down like 50, just conveniently, like by accident. But I think that actually is part of the comedy of it. That it's just somehow so fortunate for them that they can just set this one little thing in motion with one particular plan, and it goes like even more elaborate than they could have imagined just by setting up that one thing. So, yeah, stuff like that I think still works with that kind of context. but yeah, it does eventually go into the bizarre, I guess you could say. It actually, it gets so weird to the point that there's even just a quick moment of a character eating a banana. And even the way this character eats a banana is really fucking bizarre and stands out. And yeah, and then it does get to that point. But another thing that's great about the way the tone is handled, where we've already talked about how it can go from funny to sad or funny to shocking or whatever, there actually is another where we talked about him being able to make sure to give the audience time to let their imaginations run wild before certain things are revealed. There's also a moment where he's like so incredibly in tune with his audience, it's crazy. Where after a lot of the second half has happened, there is a moment kind of before the climax where there's just like a montage. And it's like this sort of really calm moment. There's still moments within this montage that aren't necessarily calm, but in regards to the rhythm of the movie, it does almost feel like this sort of... There's enough melancholy that it's kind of a settling down point before it gets to that climax, and all the craziness comes back into it. So I do think that's handled really well. And like I said, there is, you know, symbolism on top of symbolism on top of symbolism. Some of which, you know, I could see it being a bit... Some people might think it's a little too surface level, but there's still, like, there's different levels to it. Where, like, even if there's something that seems like it's not necessarily that deep, I guess you could say, there's usually a little something underneath it that does take it just a little farther than it would just be on the surface level. But even all the way down to stuff like when they're in the basement, they have, like, a stink bug infestation, and it's like to think that these people have, like, a pest in, like, their living space and in their lives that shouldn't be there. And it's, like, where they ultimately end up, it's... you get it. So it's like, it does feel like, you know, Irony 101 and everything. But like I said, there's so much of that in so many different ways that you can take the obvious with the not so obvious, and the not so subtle with the incredibly subtle. And it's just all kind of in here. I think probably has a lot to do with how I was talking about in the awards videos about how I've been hearing going in how, like, accessible it is, and how just about, even if somebody isn't particularly into, like, you know, foreign movies in general, this is something that a lot of people could get into, even if it's something that might at the start not seem like something they normally be into. And yeah, it's like I was talking about, thematically there is stuff that we've seen, not just him handle before as a director, but many cases, especially lately. The whole commentary on the classes thing, and, like, the ways in which the rich and the poor coexist and all that. Even in Snowpiercer, he covered that kind of territory, and it's stuff we see in a lot more movies as time goes on. But it's really how it goes about it. To where you don't necessarily... It would do the rest of the movie and its execution a disservice to just get hung up on the symbolism and the commentary and all that. Like, that'll certainly strengthen it in many cases, but like I said, I feel like also people tend to get a bit too wrapped up in it, and it's like there's also so many other things worth discussing in this whole product. So, yeah, and there's even, like... some of the allegories that are not so obvious, even though they kind of seem like they should be. Like, there's a bit of a Native American allegory kind of getting closer to the end, and it's interesting because you already get that sense given the whole setup. You can see where a Native American allegory would come in. But it's when we actually get some imagery. The imagery is set to, like, the most festive background that there could be. But given what it's saying about that thematically, it's this really nice contrast. So, yeah. So that's probably about all I can really say about it without going into the exact details of what happens, particularly in the second half. But as far as, like, you know, dissecting the symbolism and all that stuff, and the social commentary and all that, I wouldn't even recommend videos like this. Or any other random person on YouTube, because there's, like, a lot of videos and articles to have the director himself talking about these things. So I would definitely say seek those out as opposed to people on, like, you know, random people like myself and others like this that just kind of throw out there. I mean, if theories are your thing, just random theories that are unconfirmed, and that makes the experience more fun for you, then obviously those are probably everywhere already, if I had to guess. But I would also strongly suggest there's a lot of stuff of Bong Joon-ho talking about it himself, and that's the stuff that I would probably seek out. So, but maybe that's just me. So yeah. So let's go into two entirely different directions, or one entirely different direction, but two movies. Obviously Disney Plus launched on Tuesday, and it came with two new feature-length movies. And we'll start with Lady and the Tramp, a movie that I didn't realize was going to exist until I was looking up. Somebody had asked me what other Disney remakes were going to happen, and I was shocked when I looked it up and saw that a Lady and the Tramp remake had already been filmed, and I hadn't personally heard about it at all. And then I quickly figured out it was going to be with the Disney Plus launch. But despite that, it's still pretty much not that dissimilar from the live-action Disney remakes that have been released in theaters. So there it is. Like, I could actually very easily see this, despite the, you know, very low-budget looking effects for both of these movies. I could actually see this being one of their theatrical releases, but nevertheless, it's bumped to their streaming service. So whatever that says about how they personally feel about it, I don't know. Much like all the other live-action Disney remakes, the question is, okay, so you pretty much just remake it pretty much exactly as we've seen, especially with The Lion King, but it's like, how are you going to do that and also add an extra half an hour to it? And this is the same way. Yep, this one's like an hour 42, up against the original animated movie's an hour 15. What can you possibly add that's going to make this somehow more worthwhile or different than the other movie? Not a lot. The first question may be like, well, how are you especially going to do that? Because surely you're not going to do the Siamese cats thing now. So it's like, with that taken out, what are you going to do? But obviously the Siamese cats are, interestingly enough, crucial to the plot. So they're still in there, they just have different, they just go a different way about it. A more acceptable way, I guess you could say. To the movie's credit, it does have a really nice first shot. Like, I always love that opening of the original animated movie where it's like really, really Christmassy, and you just see like the lights and all that in the neighborhood and all that. And yeah, we get this really nice first shot of this movie, where it's like one shot that goes down into the neighborhood, then all the way up the street, and then through their window in like one shot. That looks really good. That's about as creative as we get, the first shot. But, you know, hey, they accomplished something. So I was a little worried in regards to how they were going to handle pretty much everything. Just based on the fact that we see Jim Deere and Darling's faces immediately. like that first shot, but it goes through the window, first thing we see is their fucking faces sitting there. And the thing about that is, when you watch the original movie, the whole thing was, it was kind of like from a dog's perspective, so we hardly ever saw their faces until like the end. Or scenes they weren't in. So, well, that's I guess kind of being an exception, but still. And yeah, we do see that Kirsten Clemens and Thomas Mann are the two of them, and we see their faces, and the whole thing, they get Lady for Christmas. She does, and then they announce the baby and all that. And we see them this whole time. So there's not any particular, like, it feels like there's like some sort of creative decision here. It's just like, yep, these are the characters, and we're just going to film them. With no particular, like, even the original movie like went so far out of their way to keep that up. I always like the moment when they're like coming back home and we see his like shadow on the sidewalk, and like just before he can walk into the shot, it cuts to something else. Like, they go that far to hide the faces of them to keep up the sort of dog's perspective thing going on. And like I said, this doesn't even try anything particularly creative like that. Their creative, you know, limits were that one shot. That's the first shot. But thankfully though, as much as that kind of feels like, artistically vacant, there's still not too much focus on them, which I was kind of fearing since they felt the need to show them to us in such great detail compared to the original, that I was afraid it was going to be like a lot of focus on them. But not really, just pretty much no, more or less not as much, or not any more than we saw in the original movie. We just see them. I was immediately put off when ladies started talking. Because another thing that kind of felt, right about the original movie and how they show the difference between the humans and the dogs. Like, we see it from the dog's perspective, and she doesn't, like, speak out loud until she's with other dogs that can actually hear her. There is this really jarring shot the first time we see her mouth open and she speaks when she's still in bed with them. And it's kind of terrifying when you don't know what to expect. You would think they would have better effects than this, but especially with Disney budgets, but no. And so when she does get down there, the only one where the mouth movement isn't immediately jarring, I guess, would be Trusty, but that's probably has a lot to do with the fact that his mouth is already droopy anyway, or it just kind of blends in better, I guess. But you kind of somewhat get used to it as the movie goes on. Like, it doesn't look as bad. I don't know if it just gets better as the movie goes along, or you just get used to it more, but yeah. And then, yeah, once it gets going, it hits pretty much the same beats as the original movie, just with longer scenes. There's not too much that's particularly added, but, yeah, just the scenes are longer. And every now and then they throw in, like a funny moment here that kind of works. There's a joke with two poodles early on that's pretty funny. And then there's this cute moment where lady pretends to have rabies, which is kind of funny. But other than that, it's just kind of the same beats. Kind of lacking the charm and the magic of how it looked in animation form, because you've got them so clearly like CGI on these really drab sort of backgrounds, and it all just kind of looks a little cheap, which is so weird to say with all these massive Disney productions that you see. How this is what they kind of launched off with, I don't know. But there are still the moments that do really, really, really need to work, more or less do, like the dinner scene. Doesn't look too like CGI'd up or anything like that. So that's the best you can really do compliment-wise, is it doesn't look too CGI'd up, I suppose. So there's that. But then they do something, I guess, really predictably, where they absolutely must add a frequently seen antagonist throughout the movie. So that would be the dog catcher, who of course was around in the original movie, but I mean here they try to make him like a full-on character. They're trying to make him like Sacha Baron Cohen and Hugo, basically. And he's one case where I thought, the owners were handled well enough to where there wasn't too much focus on them, even though it seemed like they were in danger of doing that. There is way too much damn focus on the dog catcher. Where it's like to cut a lot of his stuff out, where it's like, well, by the end of the movie, when he's at their house, he feels more like Michael Shannon in The Shape of Water, and I don't think that's the vibe you want to go for the dog catcher and Lady and the Tramp. So like it was way too much into that, and yeah, as it goes on, there are some obvious changes throughout, like the Siamese cats. But some of them are a bit inexplicable, like when she has to get her muzzle taken off, and in the original movie they take it to that beaver that takes it off. And in this case, it was like, yeah, all the dogs talk, but bringing a beaver into this would have probably been way too far-fetched. So it's like a statue of a beaver, and they use his teeth to pry it off. Alright. I guess that saved us another CGI abomination, because I'm sure the beaver would not have looked that good anyway. So maybe they knew that, and that's why they took that approach. It's like, let's spare them the agony. So, yeah, and then it goes on about itself with those other beats, and it's just kind of lifeless. And like I said, those effects are like really distancing, where like you hardly ever feel like Lady or the Tramp are there much at all. And it's like I kind of got stuck trying to, like, whenever they would get pet by like F. Murray Abraham playing Tony, who's an interesting casting choice. It's like I wondered what the actors were actually petting, and that's more what I was thinking about than the actual movie and any effect it may have had. So yes. And then there's also one other change at the very end, which you can see coming from a mile away, which is, you remember the little chase with the dog catcher at the end of the original movie, and then there was the crash, and then there was Trusty laying there like he was dead, and that's because he was supposed to be dead. Like he was actually dead in that moment, but then I can't remember if it was Disney or somebody didn't like that, so they animated at the last minute Trusty. Oh, he just broke a leg. But instead of doing anything to Trusty, instead of going like, hey, maybe we should actually kill Trusty this time, or going that same route at all, they decide to do the age-old thing of, no, we'll make the Tramp lay there like he's dead, and we'll have everybody crying over him, and just basically waste time until he wakes up. And that's what it is. Just dick around until he like opens his eyes and it's some triumphant moment or whatever, as if they were actually gonna, it's halfway believable they could kill Trusty, but they're not gonna kill the Tramp, so that was a waste of time. So and really what it all comes down to is it's kind of a weird concept in general. The original movie, this movie, at all, because it's two dogs falling in love. Yet they somehow make you like feel that. You feel that romanticism. It's like you're watching two dogs fall in love and you feel like it's romantic. It's why the spaghetti scene is one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. In the original was able to make that work. Whereas this one just sort of highlights the weirdness of it. Because it's like, at least in, the animated version, they're supposed to look animated. And we know that, like, from the get-go. And it's so well done that it just comes through. And here it's just so distracting how just not real these dogs are, that it becomes progressively weirder, and it makes you sort of think more and more about it. It's like, this is supposed to be romantic and moving. This is weirding me out. So, yeah. So it could have been a lot worse, but it's really... Honestly, it's probably just exactly what you would expect it to be. If you're familiar with the other live-action Disney remakes, that's pretty much all it is. So, there you go. So let's end on the other Disney Plus release, Noelle, which I saw a poster for it like a month or so back that really had me intrigued, because it was a Christmas movie starring Anna Kendrick and Bill Hader. And it's good. Obviously, I'll take anything with Bill Hader in it. And Anna Kendrick, I still have that sort of love-hate relationship with. But it was like, okay, let's see where this goes. And it's like, especially if Bill Hader's involved, it's like, is this... Not that this would be new or anything, but like from like the Disney company, and it's like, it'd be interesting. It's like, are they going to put, like, is it a Christmas movie with like a little edge to it? Because I can't really imagine Bill Hader doing something that's like totally and completely clean, like 100%. Well, not only is this not have any sort of edge whatsoever, but yeah, when I say 100% clean, I mean it is literally rated G. So it feels less like, oh, was this going to be some sort of, it felt almost identical to how everybody felt about Fred Claus when it came out. Where you see stuff, you get the idea of Fred Claus, and you're like, Vince Vaughn and Paul Giamatti, the director of Wedding Crashers? What kind of edge does this have? It's like, no, it was just a straight-up clean Christmas movie, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, unless you're Noelle, but yeah, so you could still find charm in there, and it could be something like, I wanted to embrace it as like, wow, a G-rated Christmas movie by Disney is the last thing I expected Bill Hader to do right now. Hot off of It 2 and Barry, it's like it's literally the last thing you expect him to do, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's interesting in itself. Well, not really, he's barely in the damn thing. This is definitely the Anna Kendrick show, and it really, 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 I think, just depends on how you take her in regards to how you might feel about this. Because she's basically... Well, the plot is basically Elf. Where they're brother and sister, and they are the children of Santa Claus, who dies in the first 2 minutes, I guess, of old age. It's off screen, and so it's time for Bill Hader to take over. But he panics and goes to Phoenix, Arizona, which in itself is funny. But the plot is Anna Kendrick having to go from the North Pole, completely out of her element, to the hustle and bustle, I guess, of Phoenix, Arizona. And it's just literally Elf. And that's that's exactly what it is. All the way down to her eating the thing she's not supposed to, like with him in Elf with the perfume. She does it with sunblock. It's the same damn thing. But not only that, it's less that she's channeling Will Ferrell and more like she's playing a live-action version of her character in Trolls. You see how many red flags there are here? So, yeah, and that's basically where it goes. And yeah, obviously, by the end of the movie, it's literally the Santa Claus. Like, at every turn in this movie, you can go, oh, that's literally another movie that exists. So I could maybe see this... If you would show this to a child that is, like, so incredibly young that they haven't grown up with anything, so they can't necessarily have grown up with Elf or the Santa Claus or whatever... they might get a lot more out of this. So we're talking like 3 and 4-year-olds might get a lot out of this. But yeah, that's about it. So once again, we are bombarded with really cheap-looking effects that will forever be baffling with a Disney budget. There's a point in time where Bill Hader is like training, flying the sled, and he knocks over a chimney, and I swear to Christ, this chimney collapsing is one of the most fake effects I may have ever seen, and we're talking, like, we're pulling in straight to DVD, like, horror movies into this group as well. And there's this little tiny reindeer that keeps following Anna Kendrick around for the cute factor. And everything is just so fake looking. This movie is like one giant green screen with 3 actors on it. Well, you've got Kendrick and you've got Hader, and then we've got an interesting side cast here. The main elf is Shirley MacLaine. Mrs. Claus is Julie Haggerty, which is genius casting when you just say that. But she's barely there. And we've got the this is another. It kind of turns into the plot of the Santa Claus 2 then, and probably many other movies. Where there is the other character that basically wants to take over, that has to take over Christmas because Santa's not there, and they do it, poorly and almost like a, whatever, Billy Eichner. Once again, the cast is great, but yeah, I would love to have seen what Bill Eichner could have done with this character with a better script. He could have been like, sort of like Martin Short levels, not necessarily Santa Claus 3, but I mean just in general, Martin Short levels. So, yeah, but honestly, I was mostly just bored with the thing, especially once it took off, which is usually the opposite. And it's like there's this whole thing where Kendrick goes to a private investigator that helps her find Hader, and just that whole thing, it's just, he's got a kid, and it's just a whole bunch of who the fuck cares. Like the entire middle of the movie until it just wants to be the Santa Claus. So you can see where when the movie is moving along is when it's copying another movie. When it's not copying another movie, it has no idea what to do. So it just lingers here. And that's about it. There's no like memorable scenes or anything, or memorable situations or anything like that. It's just like, oh, this character needs to do this, so they do that thing. And then it's just a series of that. Like nothing happens. Like, there's really... People say that all the time about, like, certain artsy movies. Watch this if you want a movie where nothing happens. and that's what you get. So... And obviously, you can, like... From the very first scene, you can tell where this is headed, and you know exactly where all the baits are. It's just a matter of filling it in, and just the rest of the movie is filler. And that's all it is. Until it's the Santa Claus, and then that's it. So, we've been talking a lot lately about how there is a shortage on Christmas movies that are going to stand the test of time. And it's like, where are like the future classics with Christmas movies right now? They are just not coming out. They are just not existing. And it's so yeah, and this obviously is not doing anything. This is no contribution whatsoever. So that's incredibly unfortunate. So there's a lot of stuff in here that could have worked if they expanded on it. It's definitely got a promising cast, but nothing is done with any of this stuff. So it was just as lazy as possible. And the effects will spell that out even if nothing else does. So yeah, so I think that's going to be it. So next week is more stuff. There is Frozen 2, I suppose. But also Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, and I would like to see 21 Bridges also. And I think I might as well see... So we've had a Christmas movie the past 2 weeks, might as well try out that animated movie that Netflix put out with J.K. Simmons, so we'll see what that is. And yeah, so I think that's going to be it for this, and I'll get those 2 verses out that I need to catch up on, so... And then we'll be back on track again. For the rest of this very packed and busy month of a lot of big movies coming out. So we'll see what happens with all those. So until then, that's it.